What's cracking, guys? Your boy Daniel DeBrocke here, and today I'm going to be talking about whether or not you can perform optimally on a lower carbohydrate diet. This is something that I see a lot of people talking about. I've even had a few questions about it myself, so I decided it'd be a good idea to make a little bit more of an in-depth video discussing, this topic in a little bit more depth and applying a little bit more context. So the primary objectives of this video are first and foremost to review the current scientific evidence regarding sports nutrition as it pertains to strength sports specifically. Then I want to discuss some practical considerations as well as some misconceptions regarding strength sports, regarding nutrition and substrate utilization, nutrient composition, and things like that. And then offer specific recommendations for optimal performance. We're also going to touch on things like nutrient timing and meal composition, pre, post, and peri-workout as well for optimal performance in strength training, specifically powerlifting. Now, what does the research actually say? Well, most people are already aware that carbohydrates are your body's primary and preferred energy substrate. So this isn't really something that's super contested. Where the pushback usually comes is from individuals and kind of subdivisions of the fitness space who make the claim that your bodies have a high degree of adaptability. Now, this is absolutely true. Your bodies can adapt to different environments, and this absolutely includes different food environments where maybe carbohydrates don't have a high level of availability. And so essentially the claim is if you have a diet that's higher in fat and lower in carbohydrates, your body will actually shift to become more metabolically adapted to utilizing fat as a primary energy substrate. And this is absolutely true. And from a sustainability standpoint, you can absolutely survive and probably be quite healthy as well following this dietary approach, assuming you enjoy it, adherence, and all of those other kind of caveats on that. Now, here's the thing. There is a very, very big difference between talking about sustainability of just life and health and sustainability of a high level of athletic performance. These are two completely different discussions, and it's important to make that distinction because when we look at that, we just don't see that a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet meets the same requirements that an athlete basically needs. Okay, basically when we compare these two different diets, either high fat, low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate, low fat, we see that consistently the high carbohydrate cohorts perform better, and they basically just do better in pretty much every metric than the high fat, low carbohydrate counterparts. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that they might almost approximate the performance of the higher carbohydrate diets. However, most of the evidence suggests that it either underperforms or at the very best comes close to approximating. So it really doesn't seem to be a good case for high fat, low carbohydrate diets in comparison to a higher carbohydrate and either low or moderate fat, or you can kind of divvy that up how you feel is appropriate. Now, your body has relatively low levels of glucose free glucose available in blood as well as in cells. So what happens is during exercise, you have an increase in glucose demands, and these demands are met by glycogen breakdown. So this ends up fueling your actual activity. And I'm going to actually just read this off just because it's a quote from a 2010 paper by Wildman et al., and I want to make sure that I'm getting it correctly. So essentially, they say that glucose is metabolized via glycolysis, yielding pyruvate, which can be converted to lactic acid or enter mitochondria for aerobic metabolism. Increased exercise intensity leads to the recruitment of more type 2 muscle fibers that have lower O2 availability and less mitochondria than type 1 fibers, and thus are more carbohydrate dependent and produce more lactic acid. So essentially what this is saying is that the intensity, and the duration of exercise is going to influence the type of energy substrate that is preferred. Now, in this case, for higher intensity activities, and this includes squatting, weightlifting, all of that stuff, we are going to bias type 2 muscle fiber recruitment, and that is therefore going to have a greater demand on carbohydrates because we need that for these type 2 muscle fibers to perform optimally. Now, one common sort of train of thought is that strength training, specifically powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, require they rely on the ATP-PC energy system, and therefore glycogen doesn't significantly impact performance. So the ATP-PC energy system, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and the PC stands for phosphocreatine. So this energy system essentially is responsible for very high output, short duration levels of physical exertion. This is things like sprinting, max repetition exertion. So in powerlifting and weightlifting, you know, strongman, if you're carrying a really, really heavy stone, or a max deadlift, a car lift, whatever it is, these are things that the ATP-PC system is going to be primarily responsible for. Now, although this is true, we see emerging evidence that even though that is what we're, you know, primarily reliant on, we still need to make sure that carbohydrates are available, because they actually do play a very significant role. So a 2021 paper by Houken et al. Looked at fiber type dependent utilization of muscle glycogen during heavy resistance exercise in elite powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters. So this is a very representative demographic for, again, powerlifting, weightlifting, and strength sports in general. So it's going to have a much higher carryover to what we're actually talking about in real world application. Now, what they found is that total muscle glycogen decreased by roughly 38%, but intramyofibrillar stores dropped by 54%, while 48% of fibers had significant intramyofibrillar glycogen depletion. Okay, now essentially what this means is that resistance training does tend to utilize glycogen stores. So it does actually require higher carbohydrate intake to replenish these stores. Now, research also shows that even a modest glycogen depletion can result in a meaningful reduction in performance in powerlifting and weightlifting. This has been shown even recently within the last couple of years. Okay, so even though there is kind of like this long-standing claim that, you know, we don't really rely too heavily on carbohydrates for strength sports in general, because it's just a 1 rep max, when we're actually looking at what powerlifting training actually looks like, when we're looking at the duration, the total volume, all of that stuff, it is actually fairly dependent on carbohydrates, right? We're not just doing a 1 rep max for our training. Our training is consistent of more voluminous type training, and therefore it does obviously make a lot more sense why that would be the case, that it's going to rely a little bit more on carbohydrates in the training. Now, sure, maybe when you're on competition, carbohydrates don't necessarily make quite as much of a difference, although even then I'm still a little bit skeptical. But in training, it absolutely does, and it just, you know, makes logical sense, and there's a very, you know, strong amount of evidence to actually support that as well. Now let's go to some practical considerations as well. Now, although carbohydrates do present a very clear advantage to performance, I want to make it clear that their absence won't prevent strength progression. Okay, so sometimes I hear people taking the idea that carbohydrates are important for performance, which is absolutely true. But I hear them kind of taking it and extrapolating that a little too far towards the extreme, to mean that if you don't eat carbs, you're just not going to see the progress. And that just isn't true. I know several people who follow a low carbohydrate, basically a ketogenic diet, and a ketogenic diet is very low carbohydrates. You're looking at often like 50 grams, even sometimes lower than 25 grams per day of carbohydrate consumption. So it's a very low carbohydrate intake. And I still see these individuals making progress. So can you make progress on a low carbohydrate diet? Absolutely, you can. Is it going to be optimal? No. Are you going to make the same amount of progress as, you know, if you had consumed a higher carbohydrate diet? Probably not, assuming adherence and all of the same boxes are kind of checked off. However, what is the real difference in terms of performance outcomes? This is generally where I think that we need to kind of be a little bit more rational when we're talking about nutrients, when we're talking about dietary habits and then strength and performance. So generally speaking, these differences are really going to become a lot more pronounced at higher levels of competition. So someone who is, you know, significantly more experienced and is very, very strong, they're probably going to see a lot more of a difference in terms of what their macronutrient composition looks like versus a novice or even maybe an early intermediate. So these individuals don't have tons of strength. Generally, they're pretty new and they're pretty receptive and responsive to a variety of different training stimulus. Okay, so if they're just training, they're going to get quite a bit stronger because they're still pretty new at it. So for those individuals, it's going to matter a whole lot less what they're actually eating, whether it's, you know, higher carbohydrate or biasing fats. Now, once you get up to that elite level, that's where these differences start to make a very significant difference. You know, the difference between 0.5% can literally mean the difference between getting a gold medal at the Olympics or not even making it to the podium. So these differences become a lot more pronounced the higher level you get in terms of competition. So I want to make that clear as well, because most people who are watching this probably are not the elite of the elite. So there is a little bit more room for flexibility there, and context does matter. Now, I also want to make a point about performance relative to carb intake. It's not just that there's high carb intake and low carb intake. There's a variety. There's a spectrum, right? So we can have moderate carbohydrate intake. We can have a time-restricted feeding approach where we're only having carbohydrates around a certain window. We can have a cyclic approach to carbohydrates where we have, you know, high carbohydrates on training days and lower carbohydrates on recovery days, and then basically anything else in between. Now, the reason why this is important is because, again, a lot of the times people tend to take this information and kind of extend it a little bit beyond what's actually being stated. So there's a variety of different things that you can do in order to mitigate any sort of negative repercussions that are going to come from a lower carbohydrate diet, right? So for instance, if you stack your carbohydrates around your training session, that can be pretty impactful if you're a strength athlete. So, you know, if you're fasting for a period throughout the day, or if you're just kind of, you know, on a lower carbohydrate diet, making sure that you get the majority of your carbohydrates around your training session, specifically before and during, is probably going to have the biggest impact in terms of, you know, improving or at least sustaining performance to a high degree and preserving your energy levels throughout your training session, right? So there's a lot of different things you can do, whether you're on a high, low, moderate, whatever carbohydrate diet, that can be fairly practical, that can kind of minimize some of the potential downsides of a low carbohydrate diet. Now, let's look at the specific recommendations for carbohydrates. I'm going to talk a little bit about nutrient timing. We're going to touch on fat as well as protein, since I think that that's also relevant to discuss, even though we're primarily talking about carbohydrates. So these recommendations are coming from a 2019 paper by Iraqi et al., and they are looking at bodybuilders in the off-season. Now, this is important because there are meaningful differences between powerlifters and bodybuilders. However, there's substantially more overlap in terms of their actual, you know, dietary profiles. And so I think this is very representative of a strength athlete. And the primary differences between a bodybuilder type diet and a powerlifting type diet is probably going to be a little bit more associated with nutrient timing than anything else. And what I mean by that are bodybuilders don't necessarily have any performance requirements in their training. So if you're a powerlifter, you have to hit certain numbers. You have to be progressing the load. That's the sport. So performance matters a ton. That is the thing that matters. Whereas with hypertrophy, hypertrophy is a very general adaptation. You can get hypertrophy from strength training, you can get hypertrophy from endurance training, you can get hypertrophy from plyometrics even, and like hybrid training like CrossFit. So there's a variety of different ways that you can actually stimulate hypertrophy because it's a very general adaptation. And because of that, performance is not necessarily as important as it is in a strength-based sport. So now, because of that, you're going to want to bias your carbohydrates before and during your training session. So that's probably where you're going to want most of it, because you're going to want to have a good performance and you're going to want to sustain your performance throughout the actual duration of the training session. Now, with bodybuilding, because hypertrophy is the goal and maximizing muscular development, that's the main goal, you're going to see a little bit more emphasis in terms of the post-workout nutrition, because that's where your body ends up becoming very, very stimulative, very sensitive to nutrient partitioning. And that's where you can really stimulate NPS for substantial results, right? And so that's kind of the main difference that I would say. Maybe also, you know, meal frequency throughout the day is going to be another consideration that bodybuilders will take a little bit more seriously than strength athletes. However, I still think that if you want to get the most out of strength training, you should also adopt a lot of these, you know, habits that bodybuilders maintain. Things like good meal frequency, things like optimizing your pre, peri, and post-workout nutrition. So I think these are things that are very representative of strength athletes as well, which is why I'm using this paper for the recommendations that are given here. So again, The recommendations for carbohydrates based on this paper are about 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight consumed per day. Now, I would also go as high as 7 grams per kilogram in some contexts, but again, that's going to be individual dependent. But again, I would just kind of expand that range just a little bit. Now, proximity to training absolutely impacts meal composition. Recommendations. So for instance, if you're training and you have a pre-workout meal and you're about 30 minutes away, let's say you have a bunch of pasta, a big steak, and like an avocado or something like that, right? Or like a really heavy cream-based sauce with lots and lots of fat. That's very, very rich. That's very heavy, and you're probably going to see significant slowing of gastric emptying. So that could be a pretty big issue if you're trying to train, especially if you're doing a lower body training session, you're wearing a belt, and you're just feeling really heavy, really sluggish, like you've got this big pit in your stomach because you had a really heavy and dense meal. So we want to make sure that, the closer we are to our actual training session, we take into consideration what sort of foods are going to agree with us mostly, right? And this is going to depend on the individual constitution as well. However, some good general recommendations are when you're about 30 minutes away, and even, I'd say an hour to 30 minutes away, you want to focus on moderate protein, high carb intake, and ideally no fat. And you want all of these to be fairly fast digesting. So a great recommendation would be a protein shake with a carbohydrate powder. Okay, you can have a little bit of that before and then even just kind of sip on it during your actual training session to maintain nice, even energy levels throughout your training, which will just help you psychologically and potentially help you maintain a higher output of training during your actual session. Now, if you're about 2 to 3 hours out from your actual training session, you want to think about moderate protein, high carb, and then also low to moderate fat. These you're probably going to want to have actual food from, or you're going to want to get them from actual food sources. So, you can get them from like things like chicken breast, maybe lean ground beef, fish, or a variety of other types of protein, maybe eggs, egg whites, rice, sweet potatoes, yams, regular potatoes, things like that. Okay. And then maybe having a little bit of fat. And a lot of the times if you're having, different types of protein, the fat that comes from those protein sources, like I said, if it's lean ground beef or maybe eggs, is probably also going to be enough. And you don't really need to add any additional stuff there as well. Okay. And again, that's just going to help you feel full. So you feel satiated during your training session, but you're not feeling stuffed and bloated and kind of uncomfortable, which can make training pretty unpleasant. Now, protein requirements, essentially, you're going to be wanting about 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight consumed daily. Now, if you want to get a little bit more detailed, you can actually break those up and make sure that you're getting 0.4 to 0.55 grams per kilogram per meal, and then distributing the meals, the frequency, and the total number of meals throughout the day based on your total protein requirements. So you're going to basically divvy it up to make sure that at the end of the day, your total protein requirements are hit. So if you're getting, 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, and you're distributing them, within that range that I just specified, you're doing a pretty damn good job of optimizing your protein intake. Now, fat intake should be roughly 0.5 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight consumed daily. Ideally, you want to be doing this away from training sessions. You want to be reducing fat consumption as you approximate your training session as well as after, because again, fat's going to slow gastric emptying, and post-workout in particular, we really want to make sure that we're getting those nutrients in really, really fast because your body's very, very sensitive to nutrients and nutrient partitioning. So that's going to be how you're going to kind of structure your fat intake throughout the day. Now, if you do, if you do choose to have a low carbohydrate diet or cycle your carbohydrates or have some sort of time restricted feeding, some people call it intermittent fasting, but it's really time restricted feeding. You want to bias your carbohydrates around your actual training session, before, during, and after. That's going to be where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And that's really what you want to focus on if you are utilizing some lower carbohydrate or cyclic carbohydrate approach. Okay. Now, if you guys like the post, I hope you got a lot out of this video. If you like it, make sure you share, make sure you subscribe, make sure you, follow, all of that fun stuff. I put out 2 videos like this every single week that are, do a deep dive on different topics that are relevant to strength athletes, whether it's nutrition, training, all that stuff. So hopefully you guys liked it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.